Hey everyone, thank you all so much for tuning in. Today we're going to be discussing the future of DC in film, television, and video games as announced by James Gunn earlier this week on January 31st. This is the second week in a row that I'm doing this podcast style series, so if you're enjoying it, please be sure to leave a like. If you missed last week's episode, I'll have it linked in the description below. But there is a ton of DC information to go over today. That's what this entire episode is going to be dedicated to, so let's get right into it. So after a month of profusely promising fans that they would get to hear part of Phase 1 of his new slate of DC films in January, James Gunn finally kept his promise on the last day of the month. On January 31st, he finally revealed part of Chapter 1, Gods and Monsters, which is the new direction going forward for DC. And so first, I'd just like to break down the announcements that were actually made and sort of my initial response and reaction to them. The first thing that James Gunn went over, though, was not the new projects, but the existing projects that we already know about. So Shazam 2, The Flash, Aquaman 2, and Blue Beetle, he confirmed that they are still happening, and they will actually segue right into his new interpretation of the DCU. So already this is an interesting confirmation that James Gunn is not going to do a full clean slate. He's also not going to be continuing the continuity that was established by Zack Snyder and then Walter Hamada and other creatives at DC prior to James Gunn's venture there. Instead, he's going to do something in between. He's going to do a soft reboot where some of the actors will continue to play the characters and other characters will be rebooted in both their storylines and in the actors who play them. So for example, while Viola Davis will continue to play Amanda Waller and Jason Momoa will likely to continue to play Aquaman, characters like Superman are going to be completely rebooted. They are going to retcon Man of Steel and have a completely new actor play that role. So first we're going to get Shazam 2, and I don't personally anticipate that this is going to build much toward James Gunn's new iteration of DC. I think that's going to come with the next release, which is The Flash. The Flash is going to be the film that is going to reset the DCU and provide that soft reboot. After that, we're going to get Blue Beetle, and similar to Shazam, I don't think Blue Beetle is going to be a huge departure from what we've seen so far. I don't think it's going to do wonders in setting up what James Gunn has planned. I think it's going to be a pretty standalone, self-contained story, but it will be set in the new continuity. And finally, we have Aquaman 2, which I also imagine will be similar to Shazam and Blue Beetle in that I think it will tell a pretty self-contained story. I think it will be a follow-up to the first film, but I do think that this is where we're going to get a post-credits scene that show the ramifications of the events of The Flash. I think Aquaman is likely going to get to meet the new DCU's Batman or the new DCU Superman, or they'll at least allude to one of those characters being in the film. I don't know if they'll cast the new Superman by the time the new Aquaman film is out, but I do think that that post-credits scene will at least allude to the changes that are going to be taking place in this new iteration of the DCU. James Gunn also made it very clear that Elseworld films like Matt Reeves' Batman series and Todd Phillips' Joker series will continue to be produced alongside the main DCU despite taking place outside of the main DCU's continuity. And that is one thing that I feel like the MCU has neglected. I personally enjoyed Marvel films even a little bit more when there was a bit more variety. When we had the MCU, but we also did have the Fox X-Men films, and we had the Sony Spider-Man films to just give it a little bit more variety, and I think that James Gunn is being very wise in recognizing that these characters can be portrayed multiple different ways, and that to lock them all down into a single continuity might not be the best idea. I'm a huge fan of the possibility that someone could approach James Gunn in the future and say, I want to make a Superman trilogy in the vein of the Dark Knight trilogy, and I don't want it to be connected to the main continuity, and to have James Gunn say, cool, greenlit, that sounds like a great story. I'm also really excited that James Gunn didn't just come in and cancel everything. I'm glad that we will still get to see Matt Reeves' vision for the Batman, Todd Phillips' vision of Joker. I'm really excited that we're going to get some of these Elseworld stories told outside of the main continuity, and again, I just think that's a very good move on James Gunn's part. So next we get into some of the legit new stuff. We get into Creature Commandos, and when James Gunn announced this as his sort of launching point for the new projects, I had to laugh a little bit because it's very on brand for him. I would have honestly been more surprised if he'd just come out and talked about Superman or the Batman project. James Gunn always likes doing obscure team movies and shows. It's very evident with Guardians of the Galaxy and Suicide Squad and Peacemaker that that's kind of his bread and butter. So Creature Commandos sounds totally up his alley, and I have no issue with that. That's going to be an animated show, and this is where he announced some interesting connectivity between the different mediums. So basically the idea is that the DCU will not be constrained only to feature films in the theater. There will also be live-action HBO shows, there will be animated shows, and they will have the same voice actors who play them in live action. This idea even seems to spread to the video game side of things. James Gunn seems interested in allowing some of these live-action characters to appear as motion-captured versions of themselves in video games that are tied into the DCU as well. And I think that that's an interesting concept. That's actually going to be the main second topic of this video, so hold tight. We are going to talk about the video game side of things, but for now I'm just going to finish getting through his slate. So next, he announced some more kind of obscure projects. He talked about an Amanda Waller show. He talked about The Authority and just some of those more obscure characters, but he also announced some more mainstream characters in some of their projects, and that's where I personally got quite excited. Don't get me wrong, I think it'll be interesting to see a mainstream adaptation of Booster Gold as well as Swamp Thing, but I do personally live for Batman content and Superman content, and we do actually have confirmation of the release date of the next Superman film. It will be July 11th, 2025. There also is a Batman and Robin film, with Robin being Damian Wayne, and some other Bat family members rumored to make an appearance based on other comments made by Gunn and Peter Safran, the other co-head of DC currently. There's going to be a Themyscira-based show on HBO, sort of in the style of Game of Thrones. Like I mentioned, there's going to be a Swamp Thing movie, and it sounds like it's going to be a hard R horror film from the way James Gunn was talking about it. Maybe they will lean more into the PG-13 side of things, but currently James Mangold is actually in talks to direct that film. He's the director of Logan, Walk the Line, Ford v Ferrari, so that would obviously be a very exciting name to have attached to that project. One of the more exciting projects was the Green Lantern show that they announced as well. I think that sounds really compelling. It's going to take place on Earth, and we're going to get introduced to the Green Lanterns, and I'm sure that they'll tie more into the story later, but to see them get established on a more small scale, I'm really excited to see how that goes. We're also getting a Supergirl movie. That's one that honestly really surprised me, but I'm happy that we're getting it. I think Supergirl is a vastly underrated character in the mainstream, so I'm glad that we're going to get a feature film showing her off and just allowing the audience to see this very interesting take on the character, where she's very jaded and has seen a lot of bloodshed on her home planet as she's watched everyone she loved die. It's an interesting take on the character, and I'm excited to see her brought to the big screen. So now you've heard me break down the slate and talk about how, yeah, I think that this all sounds pretty good, but honestly, like many people, I'm feeling pretty lukewarm about this. There's things that I love about it, and overall, I'm quite excited about what James Gunn announced and what he's bringing to the table, but in terms of my hype level, it's just not all that high yet. With that being said, I don't envy James Gunn's position here. There were a lot of people upset with him that he didn't restore Snyder's vision. There were a lot of people upset that he didn't move forward with Henry Cavill as Superman, and so this was definitely one of those slate reveals that isn't just going to have universal praise. So part of me thinks it was actually quite smart of him to do an informal sit-down where he just kind of appeals to our human conditions and says, yep, I'm just a fan of this stuff like you, here's what we've got planned, and we'll have more to share later. But another part of me thinks, dang, it could have been cool if you'd hired Danny Elfman or Hans Zimmer to write an epic DCU theme and, you know, show some awesome clips from previous superhero movies and show us some concept art and some maybe even actor reveals for upcoming DC projects. I understand that they're probably not quite to that phase yet, and again, I don't think that James Gunn is wanting to show us too much too soon, but with that being said, I think that that could have created a bigger splash if there had been a little bit more bravado to the announcements themselves. I also think that there's something to be said about the situation that DC has been in for a long time and how this doesn't feel particularly different. The whole pitch of the DCU is that it's going to kind of connect everything, it's going to streamline a coherent direction for DC going forward, and that is something that it has sorely lacked. And there are some fans who are just upset that Zack Snyder is not involved anymore, and you know what, I get it. It's frustrating when you have a version of a story that you really like that gets rebooted. I also empathize with a lot of the fans of the Amazing Spider-Man films. It feels totally unfair when the story that you're really invested in gets cut short. But I think even more broadly, DC fans in general have been frustrated with DC because what we've seen is project after project after project get announced, and then slowly with the weeds of time, they just get choked out. Hey, look, there's a Nightwing movie. Maybe. We're delaying it 3 years. Never mind. Oh, cool, we're gonna do Wonder Twins. Maybe. Actually, no. Hey, look, a Batgirl movie. We've finished production. We're in movie isn't that great. We're gonna just can it. And so that has been the position for a long time. And I think the reason that people aren't getting more hyped for what James Gunn has announced is two primary reasons. The first is that we got a lot of movie reveals and show announcements, but we don't really know the direction of DC. We know it's called Gods and Monsters is what Chapter 1 is called. And it does seem like it's going to be an introduction to this new iteration of Superman and to the world of Wonder Woman and Themyscira. And so we're going to start to get reintroduced to some of these heroes in the new continuity of the DCU. We're going to meet characters like Swamp Thing and Creature Commandos, so hence the monsters in Gods and Monsters. But we don't know, is this building toward a Phase 1 finale with a Justice League movie where they go up against the Injustice League? I mean, imagine if that had been the announcement. Like, we're going to do a Superman movie where it's about Superman trying to figure out who he is on Earth. He's not completely established as Superman yet, and he will be taking on Metallo, and then we're going to have our Wonder Woman show, and then we're going to have our Green Lantern show, and it's going to build toward a Justice League finale for Chapter 1, where they are going to take on the Injustice League, led by Bryan Cranston's Lex Luthor or something. I think that would have gotten more people talking, but even more than that, I think the issue is that this is what we've seen time and time again. All that we've gotten is just a bunch of movie announcements without any real concept art or anything tangible to really view these films as other than concepts. And I think it's totally fair as a DC fan to say, how many times have we been given this promise? How many times have we had a slate of DC movies that are supposed to be upcoming and then suddenly get canceled? And sure, the idea here is that, no, this is the definitive future for DC. But what happens if David Zaslav decides to sell Warner Brothers again? What if DC is then in the hands of Sony or something, and you have some Sony executives say, yeah, I actually don't like this, I want to do something else, and then suddenly cancels James Gunn's whole slate and does something completely different? Now, I don't think that's particularly likely. I think the DCU is a really smart move by David Zaslav, and I think that everyone in the industry can pretty much agree that DC needs a more solid foundation and a more coherent direction, and that's exactly what James Gunn is providing. So I do think we are going to see these projects, but I think until we see trailers, until we see casting announcements and production set photos, then I think people are going to be a little skeptical. I have noticed some other interesting criticism. Some people are honestly really upset that they are skipping to Damian Wayne with Batman and that they're not starting earlier in his lore, that maybe they're not starting with a Batman and Robin movie with Dick Grayson, but I'm okay with that, and here's why. Matt Reeves is building out a whole Batman cinematic universe by himself. We're getting a Penguin show on HBO. If Dick Grayson or Jason Todd ever show up in the universe of the Batman, we can rest assured that we're going to get a solo standalone film or HBO show that just shows their whole origin story. I'm okay with the DCU iteration of Batman skipping closer to the end of his career so that we can see the Bat family in action in the DCU, so that we can potentially see Batman Beyond in the later years of the DCU. I think that could be really compelling. And on that front, I do think we're getting the best of both worlds. We're getting multiple franchises about characters in the Batman mythology that don't necessarily have to be connected, but can showcase different parts of his saga. We can see Joker, which takes place before Bruce Wayne is even Batman, but we get to see an interesting take on Joker and now Harley Quinn. With Matt Reeves' The Batman, we can see a Batman early in his career figuring himself out that can build into its own cinematic universe of sorts, and with the DCU, we can see a more established Batman fighting alongside the Justice League and with the Bat family. I also think the idea of having shows that tie into the DCU is a good idea, and I'm not as worried as many are about the shows, or the video games for that matter, and I feel like this is maybe a good segue to talk about topic number 2 today, which is the connectivity in the DCU between mediums. Now, I want to start this off by saying that this could end disastrously. This could absolutely total the whole DCU if this is not executed correctly. With that being said, after some of the elaborations and clarifications from James Gunn and Peter Safran, I'm not as pessimistic as many people are. I think that they have already quelled a lot of my most deep-rooted concerns, and again, this could still all backfire in all of our faces, but I don't know that this is the death of the DCU before it even begins, like some seem to think it is. And this really hinges on a key factor and on how true James Gunn is to following through with this campaign promise, which is that he's mentioned a few times that not everything is going to be connected. Even with these announcements, he's confirmed that there will be Elseworld films, and he's also mentioned in tweets that not every video game is going to be connected to the larger DCU, and in fact, the ones that are will be smaller scale titles that simply tie into some of the bigger films. One example that he gave is we're doing a Superman movie and then a Supergirl movie. That doesn't mean there's going to be a Superman video game between those two. It might mean that there's a Crypto the Superdog video game set between them, set in the DCU, where you get to explore the DCU's version of Metropolis, and you get to have a smaller story about a lesser-known character who then might make a cameo in the Supergirl movie. I genuinely don't think that James Gunn means that we're only going to be getting like Crypto the Superdog and John the trash cleanup crew in Gotham City video games. I think that we are going to still be getting those big Arkham-style Batman, Superman, Suicide Squad games, and those will just be Elseworld stories. I don't think this is the death of the Arkhamverse or anything. I think they'll continue to let that universe thrive as an Elseworld story under the new DC banner as well. But I just think that James Gunn is looking to expand the mediums that he can tell his larger story through. Now, don't get me wrong, I still maintain that they need to execute this correctly. I've actually talked about this with Evan Falarka off the record, and I absolutely agree with him. He's made some great videos discussing the topic and what could go wrong. And one thing that we both agree with is it's really difficult to limit creative freedom with video games and forcing the developers to tie them to the films. Imagine, for example, that Insomniac was told halfway through developing Spider-Man PS4, actually this has to take place between Spider-Man Homecoming and Spider-Man Far From Home. So yeah, you guys are not going to be able to have some of these villains here. You're going to have to de-age Peter. He's going to have to be voiced by Tom Holland, and the story has to be way more limited. That would be a very different game and definitely a way less interesting game. Similarly, imagine if Warner Brothers had gone to Rocksteady during the development of Arkham Asylum and said, this has to be a Dark Knight sequel. This has to follow up the events of The Dark Knight, and so you can't use Joker, and you have to use Christian Bale as Batman, and you have to make Scarecrow in the style of the Nolanverse Scarecrow. Suddenly you have a way less compelling game that's really bogged down by studio interference and restrictions. On the other hand, imagine if they gave these game developers a lot of leeway, and imagine if Arkham City was set between two mainstream Batman films. Imagine if Arkham City took place between The Dark Knight and The Dark Knight Rises and was canon, and The Dark Knight opens with Bruce Wayne grieving Talia al Ghul, a character that had not been introduced prior to The Dark Knight Rises, and he's like talking about the death of Joker, and everyone would just be confused because not every filmgoer is a gamer and vice versa. But one of the things that actually gives me a lot of hope in this vein is actually James Gunn's most recent MCU project, which was Guardians of the Galaxy: The Holiday Special. It was a fun little standalone thing that was just on Disney Plus, and it's not going to be necessary viewing by the time you check out Guardians 3. It did reward the viewer for watching it, gave some cool character insights to some of those characters, but again, it wasn't a necessary piece of the saga. It was just a fun little side story told through a different medium, and my guess is that's exactly what James Gunn will be doing here. If you don't check out the Amanda Waller show, I don't think you're going to be completely confused watching Swamp Thing or the Superman movie. Similarly, I also don't think that the DCU video games are going to be required to enjoy the films, but I think that there's some interesting opportunities for those. Again, I know a lot of people are upset that they're starting this DCU Batman so late in his career. Heck, maybe we'll get a video game trilogy of smaller Batman games where we'll get to play through his origin. Or maybe they're not planning a Batman Beyond in the DCU, and so they'll make a Batman Beyond game for us to play through instead. I think that that's more what James Gunn is looking at. Or like he mentioned with Crypto the Superdog, I think just some of these characters that aren't going to get tons of screen time, but might be fun to play through a brief video game experience with. I'm not at all opposed to that idea, again, as long as that doesn't take away the fun Arkham-style games. I really do think James Gunn is smart enough to realize that a Superman game would be better suited following the Spider-Man PS4 route, where it has an original story, where it has its own creative freedoms, and is free to not have to be confined to the DCU. And honestly, every time James Gunn talks about animation and television and video games, I don't hear this idea for an all-encompassing everything must be connected. I hear this idea that, you know what, Creature Commandos don't really deserve a full feature film. We're going to do an animated series, and they will tie into the DCU. They're not going to be required viewing to enjoy some of the films, but if you want to see more of the lore of the DCU, there you go. I think there's going to be plenty of room for projects like Batman Caped Crusader and My Adventures with Superman, that other animated show, or that animated Aquaman show. I think that there's going to be plenty of room for a lot of different projects in many different universes. I think that the Elseworlds idea is going to be pretty substantial. Again, this could completely blow up if it's executed poorly, but the way that it sounds like James Gunn is planning on executing it is having a main central hub, the DCU, that's going to tell a very cohesive story that does what the MCU did. It pulls from a lot of different characters to tell a single story, and he's going to use the video game, the film, and the television medium to tell that story. And they're going to be self-contained enough that you can enjoy any of the single projects on their own, or you can enjoy a combination of them, or you can enjoy all of them and get the full experience. But on the side, there's also room for Matt Reeves' The Batman, Todd Phillips' Joker, Rocksteady's Arkhamverse, a standalone animated Batman show. I'm personally really excited for the future of DC, though I am trepidatious because I feel that we've had all of these campaign promises before, and I don't want to be let down again. So is the future of DC bright? I think so. I think that there's plenty of room for some fantastic storytelling from a variety of filmmakers and a variety of genres, both in the main continuity as well as the Elseworld continuities. If this is executed right, this could take what the MCU did and even elaborate upon that and do something even more robust. So this is a situation where I am excited, but I'm also trepidatious, and I'm eager to see what we have in store for us. I think this was a good first step. These announcements are interesting and have piqued my curiosity, but I think that it remains to be seen how much I'll actually enjoy this direction for DC. But I would like to hear your thoughts, so please feel free to leave those in the comments section below. Please be sure to like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and thank you all so much for tuning in to this discussion. Make sure to tune in again next week, and we will see you guys in the next one.